Good afternoon and welcome to the EUROCONTROL Stakeholder Forum. My name is Philip Hughes from EUROCONTROL, and today we want to discuss what needs to be done to ensure that the future standardization framework is both efficient and fit for purpose to deliver a sustainable, modernized system. In this webinar, the fourth technical webinar in the EUROCONTROL Stakeholder Forum series, we take a critical look at standardization, focusing on the role that standards should play in closing the industrialization gap between research and deployment and in supporting the future development of aviation. For this discussion, we've lined up a panel of influential experts from leading aviation organizations who will help us build a clearer picture of the latest developments and regulations in standards in Europe and help us to understand what is the way ahead. We're delighted to welcome Alan Leroy, who is the Chief Engineer at EASA, Bruno Arel, Director of ATC Product Lines with Alice, who is also Council President of EUROCONTROL, and Robin Garrity, Senior External Affairs Officer at the CESAR Joint Undertaking. So our panelists will tackle the big questions for standardization, which are, can standards live up to the political expectations about more rapid deployments and successful deployment of a sustainable aviation system? How do we successfully tackle the industrialization gap in aviation projects? What are the main challenges that need to be addressed to deliver the standardization framework of the future? And how can regulators, planners, customers, and developers of standards work together to deliver that framework? So the format of the discussions today will be that each of the panelists will make a brief introduction in terms of their point of view based on the main questions which we've asked. There is then an opportunity for you to ask questions and answers to our panel via our webinar. And if you should be experiencing any issues, please use the chat function to tell us if something is not going as planned, and we will try and do our best to remedy that. So without further ado, I'd first of all like to ask Alan Leroy to take the floor and kick off the discussion. So Alan, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Philip, and I'm very pleased to be with you all today. The title of the webinar, in fact, is already very entertaining. I have found a few keywords here. We have efficiency, we have sustainability, and modernized. Well, modernized, I would say, rather how to deal with the disruptive models, how to deal with the new technologies, and how to make sure that the complete system remains fit for purpose and can follow the industry development at the same pace. So just to talk about standard developments and how we, as a safety regulator, see them now and in the near future. Basically, we have a main challenge ahead of us. The world is changing. And well, it's not only the pandemic and all what is going on with it, it's also the new green approach, how to be sustainable, how to have new mindset, how to have new development for aviation. And here standards will play a key role. I'll come back later on that one. But really, sustainability is not a buzzword, it's a reality. I'm working on all kinds of innovative programs in the agency, with industry, with clean aviation, with other partners. Each and every second meeting, we have to bear in mind how to go through decarbonization, how to go through sustainable fuel and so forth. And it is valid for any domain, including ATM, that's for sure. So in that respect, we have really to approach our common work in a different way. And that's why modernized, I was a bit hesitant, because modernized maybe is a bit negative in the connotation. How to be agile, how to approach the new world in a way to offer to the community an aviation system which is still credible and accepted by the society. Interesting in the program also, I found another few keywords, the gaps. And gap is really something we do not like, be it in development, be it in research and so forth. But what we see, again, from a safety regulator perspective, is many times we have very, very interesting research program developments, which are really interesting, but we're not able to to offer solutions to implement them or to manufacture. I'm coming from the manufacturing world, so we have the same problematic. How to make sure that what we develop as a concept can be transposed into the concrete world. It's not a challenge we have been always very good at tackling with, but we are working on it all together. So this gap, be it in research, be it in development, be it in new technology, it needs really that as a system altogether, we work in the kind of coordinated manner. We have to unify efforts. We have to be better at defining common priorities. And again, industry in general, standard body as well, we should find a way altogether to define common priorities to make sure that what we see under research, under new concept, can be implemented in a safe way. And we have plenty of examples of concepts developed, but which have been put into trouble to become concrete on the industry side, on the manufacturing side, in many domains. So in a nutshell here, the role we see for standardization bodies together with us as a regulator is to pick up altogether the right priorities and to work commonly on those priorities. We have seen too many times maybe common initiatives in good faith to develop the same standard, let's say, or the same means of compliance or of implementation. And at the end of the day, you have organization A, B, and C doing the same thing. When we are lucky, they achieve the same result, sometimes slightly different. And as a regulator, we have a big problem, how to take credit, how to take into account those proposed standards or not. So here, through the new coordination bodies, I'm sure we'll come back later into the discussion on those EU new bodies, in which we really play now a key role since we are leading them. We would really like to work with you all on defining those priorities which will allow all of us to achieve a common objective. And that's easy to say, but from experience, in any domain, from design to ATM, it is our weak point. We are all enthusiastic, we are all professionals, and we want to deliver, but sometimes we have to sit down together and agree on who is doing what, how, for which purpose, according to which safety objectives, and as a regulator, then we can take full benefit and full credit for them. So that's something really we should not underestimate. And then if we are good at doing so, there will still be some challenges. We will come back later on it, I'm pretty sure, for the questions. But the planning of activities, the definitions of program, and then the implementation will be much easier. I would like to come back on sustainability and how we can really all together dream a bit about what to do and how to do. This 2 weeks ago, the agency sort of advertisement for what ESA is doing. I just put a disclaimer before, but we issued the first certification for CO2 emission of an aircraft. A few years ago, this would have looked totally impossible, but we did it. And why could we do it? Because all teams unify their efforts to develop all of the necessary material. It's a first of a kind in the aviation world, this CO2 certification, and it has been a success thanks to the unified effort from all sectors to develop the specification, the certification specification, the necessary standard, the methodology for demonstration, the testing, and so forth. So that's an example I just wanted to quote as a success. It's better to quote a success than a failure as an example. And again, the cause for this success was that all dots were connected, all the stars were aligned, and at the end of the day, all actors, all players were able to play their role in a really efficient way. So that was my overall message. If I have to summarize, we need to work together. We need to identify priorities together. And as a regulator, then we will be able to identify which standard we can really give credit to, which will help industry to implement better or faster the solutions which are under development. Thank you.
Thanks, Alain. Very interesting. You covered quite a good range of subjects there. So I now turn the floor over to Bruno. Bruno.
Thank you, Philippe, and good afternoon to all the attendees. Just a small clarification before I start. As Philippe mentioned, I'm working with Thales, land and air systems, and developing mainly ground ATM systems. And that's as a member of the Thales industrial company that I will speak today, and not as my second hat, which is the chair and the president now of the Council of EUROCONTROL, which is quite a different hat, and that could be relevant, and maybe I will have to speak as a president of this council, but I will try to speak more as a representative of the manufacturing industry here. So if I just start with this topic, I would say we need to maybe recall what's this role of standards in aviation, and just to remind that, okay, standards is something that we are discussing a lot, and we will come back to the reason why Alain already identified some topics why we are talking so much, but it's not something new here, and we know, and of course all of us know, and Heasa knows very well, and certainly much better than I do, how standards are important in the designing and developing of industrializing of aviation equipment and systems, and how they are important in supporting the certification process, and how they have been successful so far to support this certification process for all this airborne equipment and systems. Now, of course, they are support to certification for sure. They also support for interoperability as to when we go to interfacing and having different systems and solutions in general, or whatever components that have to work together in order to provide a given solution, a given operation. We need to ensure that these components and equipment have the proper interface defined, and that it works according to well-known standards, so that we can ensure that these equipment and systems come from different vendors without having any difficulty in working together. So all that is nice and good for the standards, and we know that's something that we have on the table. So I can try and give here some consideration what these standards are seen from a manufacturing industry point of view. And the first point I think is very important, and at least for us in Thales is quite essential, that the standards, the elaboration of standards involves the experts of the domain, and that it's put together all I would say the relevant industrial actors and experts that have to work on this. This is really the basis for this consensus-based standards that we favor so much. Okay, this is expert-based, consensus-based, so that we make sure that all the parties involved and interested have been involved in the standard definition, and so that we make sure that we give confidence and trust in the standard and the fact that it can be industrialized and deployed. The first point, this is really essential. The second point is that we need, it's been said already, we certainly need standards which are fit for purpose. But really, when we have something to be fit for purpose, we need to know what is the purpose first. And the purpose is something that we need to really work upon. What is the need? What is the actual need for a given standard? Standard, they have lots of benefits, lots of virtues, I would say, in the sense that they support harmonization, they support interoperability, they support standardization. Yet, too many standards, the right level of standard is good I would say, to encourage innovation, but too many standards are just killing innovation, possibly. So we need to make sure that we really understand and agree on which standards are needed and why, and to make sure that they are actually then fit for purpose. This third point here I would mention is the fact that we cannot define standard just out of the blue because we have a new solution, we want something. That the standard, they need to integrate with the solution themselves in something bigger, which is I would say a system and system of systems, very likely in our domain. And so the standard needs to have a given place in this overall structure. So that's just to refer to the fact that when we go and defining standards, in order to avoid to have things which are overlapping or things which are not consistent or things which are contradictory, we need to, I would say, align them across, I would say, a reference architecture for the system or system of system. And this reference architecture is something that is really very important. Otherwise, we will easily end up with standards that are not properly aligned to the need, and we will not really share and understand jointly the need for this standard. A point that needs to be mentioned here, because I think that it's fairly important, mainly in this type of discussion where we are hosted by Eurocontrol and in a fairly European environment, is that for the manufacturing industry point of view, that's important that we have standards which are defined, recognized, and applied internationally. That's very important because for our developing systems and equipment, if we want to go and deploy and develop a product that has the expected outreach and the expected market, it's much better if we can have something that works everywhere around the world and is not limited to a given region, because there is some specific standard that applies that does not apply for another region. So that's something that needs to be taken into account. Of course, if we are based in Europe, we will favor standards developed more from Europe, but it doesn't mean that it has not a global outreach, and it's important for this that we favor this standard with more global and international outreach. Of course, this needs to have some work globally with some, I would say, work on the global harmonization and not only for standards, but also for the operation and regulation, so that enables these international standards to be developed. So the international institution, and of course, starting with ICAO, has a key role to play for that in order to foster the harmonization internationally. Well, we can say, if I just put for some minutes my hat from EUROCA, and we just can notice that EUROCA develops quite a number of international partnerships, and that there is quite a number of joint working groups, standardization working group between EUROCA, RTCA, EUROCA, SE, and some other standardization organization, which is, I would say, a very good move in the sense of ensuring the more global outreach of the standard we produce and avoid having things that are not completely consistent and reinventing the wheel, as we may say. So these were more or less the topics I wanted to highlight concerning the standards and I would say the important point with that regarding the manufacturing industry. So now we have the point that, okay, well, is there something changing now? That's something that we know for some many years, I would say even. Now, is there something changing? Yes, Alain mentioned it very well. There are plenty of things coming on, and okay, we can mention that there is a huge call for change in the aviation at the moment. Of course, Alain mentioned the environmental sustainability. We have called for resilience. We have called for evolutiveness. Okay, we have the call for having more open market and more open, I would say, competition in this market for the industrial solutions. We want to have reduced lead times and time to put in operation. We want to have introduction of new technology, the artificial intelligence, for example. We have the problem of cyber protection and the cyber risks. So we have the introduction of a new type of, I would say, airborne systems like all the drones and unmanned traffic. So that's quite a number of things that are changing. And in terms of the ATM now, I will speak more for that I know quite better. It will result in a very strong in-depth transformation. Okay, that will affect the business aspects and the underlying technical systems and services. This induces digitization and service orientation. This is okay, and all this is very well reflected in the airspace architecture study that we all together work upon now for some time, and this introduction of the data service providers in the ATM domain. So all this is changing. The standards, of course, they will play a key role in the transformation. There will be facilitators for the digitalization. There will be facilitators for this service orientation, and they will support the certification framework that obviously needs to evolve to support and follow this. What is important to note here is that there will be certainly a need for more standards, okay? Because the trend will be to build more and more solutions at final grain service level. final grain services components will be something different from the current system we know today, which are, as so many people claim, so monolithic. So now we need to go to something that is more agile, that with smaller chunks. And of course, this will result in a need to define more and more interfaces that will be subject to standardization. Okay, and these interfaces and APIs, they will enable the required level of interoperability within this overall system. And this will be important, key for the industrial supplier to make sure that we put on the market products that will be suitable for proper integration in this complex environment. Some words about the industrialization gap, maybe. The industrialization gap, we know it's not something that is specific to aviation. That's a very general problem around the industries. That is what is called usually the valley of death, that's coming out of the research and technology activities. With nice prototypes that were perfectly in environmental environment, and then facing a problem when going to the real environment, to the industrial domain, and to put in operation the whole thing. That's something that is very usual and very linked to the changing of scale, moving from this experimental environment and so on, and moving to something which is different, where maybe we missed some technical elements, maybe we have not analyzed everything, and we missed, for example, how the solution will behave in degraded conditions, specific modes of operations, and so on. Maybe we have missed some particular functional aspects of it. Maybe we underestimated the impact of safety certification. Maybe that's something that was not tackled at the right level at the beginning. Maybe we have also problems with the business aspect of it. Do we have a business case that is really I would say credible and that can be really trusted by all the stakeholders, so that they are confident when they have to invest in development. So, of course, standardization is part of it, but it's only one element of it. That's an overall puzzle we have to put together when we go to industrialization and deployment of the solutions. And we have to really take care about what is the actual role and impact of standardization. It's part of it, but it's an element of it, not the whole thing. And it will not solve everything by standardization. It's more than that. We need to really bring confidence and trust in the fact that deploying the solution is feasible, achievable, and beneficial. So if we want to improve, I don't know exactly where I'm with regards to time, so Philippe, do not hesitate.
You're doing fine, you're good, yeah.
If it's too long, but standardization, if I can say some words about the improving possibilities for improving standardization as seen from my seat here, I would say that an important aspect maybe is that we need to take into account standardization and the need for standardization as early as possible. We're in the development and research cycle, okay? It's not something that you do at the end. It's not you develop a very wonderful solution, and at the end of the day, you say, now, do we need standard? And it's a little bit the same as if you say, let's go for a solution, and at the end of the day, you say, do we have some certification aspect to take into account, or safety aspects to take into account? It's fairly too late to do that, because maybe it will induce rework and so on. So take into account standardization as early as possible, the needs for standardization as early as possible in the cycle when we go in the R&T project is something that is really certainly beneficial for the overall cycle. And then we can ask questions. Do we need to have a standard for this particular aspect? We have some solution that implies some interoperability. Yes, certainly we need standard. What is exactly the scope of the standard? Where does it apply? When we have this standard that is the need for standardization that is identified, the need for a standard that is identified, then we are early enough so that we can ask some questions that certainly jumps back to what Alain just said, is do we have already some standardization activity going on this topic? Do we already have something existing elsewhere in the world? And we can start to have some analysis of if we need to develop a new standard or if we can reuse something that is already existing or already ongoing. So that's time we can save and make sure that we do not reinvent the wheel, which is very often the problem we have. I would mention that, of course, complexity is also an element in that. Bon, that's not something that we can always solve. There are things that are complex by nature, but in some cases, maybe thinking early in advance will help. Maybe splitting things in smaller chunks when we can maybe address easily the standardization aspect in an easier way. So that's the other point. Okay, so that's start working on the need for standardization as early as possible in the cycle, and try to have smaller things, and maybe to break this complexity that we may see sometimes. Of course, back to the analysis of the existing standards and the fact that likely we have to avoid reinventing the wheel, and nobody wants that. And I heard Alain saying that people were very enthusiastic and very often going without taking care. But I think that this time is a bit finished. I mean, we have now moved in maturity in our industrial and I would say engineering processes, so that we can take care about the fact that things existing, and it's good to reuse what is on the table.
Good.
And I'm not so far from the end. Actually, I want just to remind that okay, it's also, of course, we need to. We are industry. We want to take part to the elaboration of standards. That's essential. We have experts. We want them to be there. We want to make sure that the standards are based on consensus and that they reflect, I would say, the shared communication, the shared understanding and conception of the whole community. That's really an element of collaboration, which is very important and exists for a very long time in the standardization. I would say process and procedures that we have in place. It's very important that as industry, I would say, putting ourselves as a kind of customer of that, we want to have an expert participating to standard elaboration and definitions, but we want to have a strong and reliable standardization organization that can support this standardization work. Okay, and I can put my hat of EUROCAE again and say thanks to EUROCAE, because that's very important that the work is done properly and that we have the environment that we need to build, and with sound processes, guidance, logistics, and so on to make sure the standards are performed. And of course, coordinations of the standardization activities, it's something that is mandatory, because of course what we expect and what we want as a manufacturing industry, bringing experts in the building of standards, is the elaboration of standards, is that we avoid duplicating the work and wasting effort in doing things that are done elsewhere, and that can be certainly put in synergy at some stage. So that's more or less what I want to say up front. So now, thank you for all for listening, and the floor is back to you, Philippe. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruno. That was an excellent balancing act between the industry and EUROCAE. Again, interesting to see some of the same themes coming out in terms of particularly in relation to cooperation and perhaps, making sure from a timing point of view, we get more engaged with standards and that we reuse what we have. So at this stage, I'd like to call on Robin to give us the research and development, the other side of the part, the perspective from the research and development side in terms of what his views are in the role of standardization. Robin.
Thank you, Philip, and good afternoon, everybody. A real pleasure to be here. It's often considered that standardization sits squarely in the domain of industrialization, with research and development only performing a preparatory role. There is, of course, some truth in this, but R&D can perform much, much more in helping to ensure that standardization takes off in the right direction and addresses needs that have been identified as a result of a more rigorous and validated research. In some cases, both research and demonstration projects can start the standards development process. Indeed, as Bruno was just saying, by working with the standards development organizations during their activities before handing over at a more appropriate time for industrialization. Political expectations are currently very high to support the development of a sustainable aviation system, as both the previous speakers have mentioned, and standards are vital to the achievement of this goal. As we move towards a more service-based environment, the nature of standards may change, but the need for them will not. Stakeholders will need to interoperate, and this implies both the system interoperability requirement as well as a service level requirement, both of which can be supported by standards, some from non-aviation sources. Successful achievement of this balance will be built on effective research and development. The aviation world is coming under pressure, as explained by both the previous speakers at some length, from all directions to improve its environmental footprint. And for this reason, the Green Deal is a core element of the CESAR 3 research planning. This is vital, and just as research will need to consider sustainability issues in every concept under this development, so must standardization. Sustainability must be targeted and measured as for any other performance criterion. The political will is ambitious and will require regulatory changes and adoption of a new paradigm on the part of all types of service provider. But this cannot be implemented in any manner that jeopardizes safety, even in pursuit of more flexible service delivery. Effective standardization will support this. R&D must adapt too, to ensure the output of research and demonstration projects lays the foundation for effective standardization and enables the continuation of standardization activities through coordination and collaboration with appropriate external agencies, both within Europe and globally. Much has been spoken of the V4 or industrialization gap, and as Bruno made very clear, it's not just a question of standardization. But even with just standardization, we need to be a little bit careful not to take all rhetoric at face value. For example, different CESAR projects have had varying involvement levels in standardization. Some EUROCONTROL working groups have teams that are composed of many of the same organizations and individuals who are performing the actual research itself within CESAR projects, as well as demonstrations and deployments. In these cases, standards can emerge pretty much ready to go alongside the V3 maturity of the project being researched. This helps to ensure that there is no V4 gap at all, at least from a standardization perspective. Other projects, however, reach V3 maturity without direct involvement in the standardization process and finish by making recommendations. Of course, both models are good, depending on the concept being validated. It's perfectly acceptable for standards to be defined after the achievement of V3, but we must avoid their being identified during research and then overlooked during industrialization. This brings the need for better coordination in the overall process. There is also an important driver for the new demonstrators planned as part of CESAR 3, where research and trial deployments, sometimes on a very large scale, can move beyond V3 and directly provide results that support deployment through the maturing of standards as a result of lessons learned during these demonstrations. That this works has already been shown in previous successful CESAR demonstrations. I see four main challenges to delivering the standardization framework of the future. Firstly, the move towards a more service-oriented environment will change all elements of aviation service provision. This means, as well as ensuring interoperability at system level, we will also have to address the service provision level. Underpinned by regulations, there will be a need for standards to ensure safe and interoperable service delivery at all levels. This is largely new and must be addressed at the research phase as well as during the deployment. Secondly, use of open non-aviation standards seems like a good way of accelerating standards development, but we must be cautious as other domains do not necessarily have the same need for safety assurance that exists in the aviation domain. We should reuse open standards where possible, refine standards to meet aviation needs where some aviation-specific needs are absent, or write from new where needed. The overriding concern is to ensure that any standards development organization is proved to be capable of operating to the level of rigor commensurate with the task in hand. Use of such open standards should be considered during the research phases, and projects could make recommendations where such standards could accelerate the standardization process. Thirdly, the generation of any new governance framework, especially when it results from a politically driven idea, runs the risk of prioritizing the political aims rather than the needs of any particular concept or technology. Any new framework must remember that the consensual nature of standards development has served us well, and that all stakeholders have a view and maybe a different need. Not all standards directly support regulation, for example, and care must be taken to ensure that any new framework should support such needs as well as the bigger issues. After all, much standards development is undertaken by experts whose time is allocated by a company in an unpaid activity. If they stop getting value from the process, they simply won't come. Finally, AI and high levels of automation are becoming more prevalent in every aspect of our lives, and aviation is no different. This introduces significantly increased complexity into our world, where we are not yet sure how to certify AI, machine learning, and autonomy. Work is underway, of course, but this increased complexity must be recognized and managed so that any attempt to accelerate the standardization process does not run the risk of introducing hidden dangers that could emerge due to the lack of appropriate rigor. Research will play a big part here, and the concepts supported by AI and machine learning should be researched in parallel with the mechanisms for ensuring safe certification and standardization. I believe that the will to cooperate in Europe is strong in the standardization domain and always has been. This cooperation and collaboration must be allowed to continue even as we move towards a new political vision with a tighter management of standardization activities. This need for a top-down vision and a collaborative standardization environment are not mutually exclusive. Indeed, by creating a more central standardization management body drawing on regulatory direction, the output of CESAR research, and independent industrial advancement, we should be able to introduce great efficiencies into the process for deciding what standard is needed, by when, and deciding who's going to produce it. It also facilitates centralized coordination with non-aviation stakeholders and standardization bodies, as well as similar international agencies. I believe the new vision for the EASCG, which will be chaired by EASA and comprise stakeholders from all sides of aviation, including R&D, will satisfy this need and can only be a good thing for the future of European aviation standardization. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin. So there's, from the three presentations, I think there's lots and lots of interesting things we can touch on. So let's start with the probably with the thing that Robin touched on in terms of the rate of change and how we could do that. So if I turn to Alan, how do you think we need to go about creating a better program and framework for standardization, particularly given the rate of change and all of the issues that Robin addressed there? And how do you see that coordination and the working together piece working, Alan? How do you see that developing?
I think it was already introduced by the two previous presenters, so I will just start from what you said about the coordination group, for instance. We really need to join our efforts, and also maybe to remind something which is very important. A standard in itself is okay, but a standard as a mean of compliance or as an implementation mean to regulation is even much better. I think we all agree here. So in this respect, the world is changing. We have to be, the usual words, we have to be agile and so forth. The EACG, for instance, for us, and we're really prepared to invest time and effort in this group to set exactly what you mentioned before, to set common priorities, work program, and to identify the points where we should really come up with something. That's again with the objective later on to offer something, a standard, which should really be taken over almost one-to-one as an implementation means or means of compliance in other domains to regulation. And if we are able to achieve this for emerging technologies, for new models, for disruptive concept, we are really on the way. But we need to organize ourselves. Industry, and I think Bruno was very clear in that respect, is putting a lot of effort to organize this activity through various bodies, through standardization bodies, but also through industry bodies like ISD and so forth. But then after, we need to have this regulator in a broad sense, this regulator approach where we could, together with you, decide on where we want to go and where do we need to put our efforts. If we can do so, I think we will not fill all of the gaps we have been faced in different industry sectors, but we will be on a much safer ground. Thank you.
Okay. So Bruno, if we examine that thing from the industry point of view, I think, look, going back to the policy, I suppose, which emanates from the airspace architecture study, it appeared to imply that a lack of standards was a main causal factor for the gaps which we alluded to. So there needs to be a clearer focus on accelerating industrialization. But you know, is that the main lesson we want to do? Should we be turning out standards more quickly? We also have a question on the line as well about the timing of standardizations from Alexander, where he said that, you know, standardization needs to be considered early in the development process, which was a point which you made. However, should it not be the role of standards to describe a solution that has proven to be mature rather than being a tool for research and development? So what are your views in terms of that?
Thank you. Yes, I think that, well, we more or less, the three of us, we more or less have tackled already a significant part of this. The first point I would say is that it's very difficult for me, if I see that from the manufacturing industry point of view, that to consider that the blocking factor in industrialization is really the lack of standard. That's, to me, it's more, I would say, an effect of, I would say, more in-depth problems that we may have with a given solution, and the fact that maybe, I don't know, there are different cases, but maybe the research has been stopped too early, or all the aspects have not been considered, or as I mentioned previously, the business impact of the solution has not been fully analyzed, and so on. And in general, I would say that it's more the fact that there is a lack of trust and confidence, as I said previously, in the solution, that blocks things rather than just merely the fact that there is a standard missing somewhere. So I think that's the first point to be taken into account. If we now say, okay, there is still this gap, industrialization gap, I think that Robin gave a very good way of doing it. Okay, it's true that we see that in Cesar 3 now we have this notion emerging of these digital sky demonstrators that is really bringing, I would say, the activity and supporting the activity much further in the maturity of the solution, and that's really what is needed. So to have some framework, to have some support, to go further, and making sure that we can go in pre-deployment, pilot deployment, and so on, so that we have a support for that, and that's very important, because very often the problem is, as I said, confidence may be a little low, people may be a little, stakeholders may be a little shy, and the things are more or less blocked because there is this lack of trust. And then if we go for having a faster standard, okay, what is sure from my point of view that we have and it's been said and shared by us, I guess, there will be likely a need for more standards, because there will be we go for finer grain, we have this service orientation and so on and so on. We'll go something that where standards will have been developed in more more numerous, but still, hopefully, this means at the same time that certainly there will be, I would say, not on the overall system, but individually, these standards may be simpler. Okay, so that may be a change in the fact that, okay, we can manage to maybe have faster development of the standard. And again, as we all mentioned also, maybe the key of that is to take the problems as soon as possible in the life cycle. And when we start thinking about new solutions, new services, and so on, we need to bring the question that what will be the need for standard and start working. And as Robin mentioned, there are many possibilities where there are some R&D activities that go together with the I would say the standard development, and that we can make sure. And it's very often that, as Robin mentioned, the people are just the same, because the experts, they are not so numerous that the people can be different. So voilà, that's what I can answer at this stage for the question.
Okay, so Robin, just leading on from that, I mean, you've touched on the points where there were many examples of successful deployment where standards weren't necessarily immediately needed. Is it right to have a solution maturity assessment in Cesar that relies on the existence of standards, or because this has been an item for debate before? And then touching on that, how, to go back to your point, how do you accelerate research and development while at the same time maintaining the safety criteria, obviously, in the standards which we require?
Yeah, thank you, Philip. I think we need to take a little step backwards here and look from a research perspective. We use the European operational concept validation methodology, and that's quite important, the operational concept. So when we get to V3, what we're saying is that we've had this idea for an operational solution to a given problem, and then we've researched it using an iterative process and got to the level where we think this operational concept is ready for industrialization, not for deployment, for industrialization. That's V3. Now, this is actually quite important because it doesn't imply that the standards are ready. That doesn't necessarily mean they can't be. And we've got examples where some programs, if I make an example, there's just an example, there are plenty of others. ASM GCS, Working Group 41 within EUROCONTROL, the teams of standardization producing bodies and agencies have worked extremely closely, and in fact are part of the CESAR programs as well. So as the solutions appear, the standards appear about the same time. In that particular example, that is possible. It's not always possible to do that. In some operational concepts, you'll get to the end and you'll produce your idea and you say, you know what, this is really good, it works, we can provide the benefit, but you can have connectivity that would probably be enhanced by standardization, but you haven't really started looking at the standardization in depth. It's then, or it's during this process somewhere, that you need to be able to identify the emerging need for standardization and then put the pieces in place to make it happen at the appropriate time. And this is where the increase in cooperation and collaboration that's being proposed is vital, because it does not just have to wait till the program to finish and then suddenly people to say, oh, there's no standard. It shouldn't be like that. It should be an iterative process that identifies the need, and in the main it is like that, but having a new body that identifies that, puts it on a roadmap early enough, starts to get players in the right place, I think that will help the process. So the short answer to your first question is yes, I think it's perfectly good to have a V3 mature solution declared as being V3 mature without standards in place, but not to have a roadmap to them would be wrong. We need to have that visibility of where they will be needed. As for acceleration of the process, I'm always a little bit wary of the word accelerate, because it can carry with it the impression of a lack of rigor, cutting corners, rushing, and I don't think any of us would think that's a good way to go. What we have to do is make sure that the standardized, sorry about that if you heard that, it's our fishmonger arriving. We need to
live. This is a live broadcast.
Indeed, it's a real world, yes. So we have to make sure that whatever process that we have, the standards that come out the other end are fit for purpose and high quality. And this is what Bruno was touching on. We need to ensure that there's no shortcut to a good answer. And this is likely to become more complicated in the bigger picture because of things like AI and machine learning, which is actually massively increasing the complexity of our work. So therefore, that would imply an increase in rigor. However, as Bruno also says, if we have a larger number of smaller standards, that might make the detail easier. Time will tell. But I think, yes, we can accelerate it through increases in efficiency, better coordination, better planning, but we should not take any shortcuts.
Thanks, Robin. So yeah, that's interesting, and I think everybody has focused on the collaboration piece, but at the same time maintaining the standards. So if I look at something which a number of you have touched on, and we have some questions actually on the live chat, is around what's the implication for, you know, future service-oriented architecture and ATM systems? Because now you're going to be using more COTS, you're going to have more interfaces, requiring more open non-aviation standards. So Alan, if I can come to you, I mean, as a regulator, that obviously it represents a challenge, and I think it's probably fair to say it represents perhaps a mind change which is required in the ATM industry. How do you see this progressing if we are going to move to service-oriented architecture?
It's an interesting change in mindset, in fact. And the open standards, it has always been a challenge to the regulator. We're in a given sector, we are used to develop our regulatory environment, our specification, our safety objectives, our performance objectives, etc. And we are very comfortable with our own set of specifications, regulations, and standards. Bon, this was a bit the past and today. With all what we said before, it's obvious that with a new service-oriented approach, with the new technologies, AI, machine learning, as you mentioned, we have to shift our mind, and we have to see how to bridge with other worlds, with other sectors. I would just pick up an example which is outside of ATM, but which gives you an idea on the change we are now undergoing in EASA. And it is valid for all domains. For years, we were used to work with DO for very good reasons, safety assessment, development assurance. We were really in a very specific frame, and it worked. Now comes the time to be prepared for AI, for new technologies, for new software, for new hardwares. And those DOs were heavily criticized by industry because, of course, they would prevent the development and the implementation of this new system. So you see the link here. And what have we done? We are working with other safety regulators to identify a possible bridge between our standards and other industry standards, be it automotive, nuclear, whatsoever. And I think that's what we have to go through. We define high-level objectives, be it safety or performance as a regulator. That's what we really have to do. In the past, let's be honest, we were a bit too prescriptive sometimes, and the prescriptiveness prevents the innovation, or not prevents, but limits the capability to develop. So what we do now is really to bridge with other systems, to find a way to take into account directly those other standards. And for experts, it is not easy because we have to extract from the 178B or whatsoever those objectives. What do we really want as a regulator together with the industry community and the standards bodies, so that we can make use of automotive standard XYZ. And I think for COTS in particular, if we are not able altogether to develop to the extreme this approach, we may run into trouble because we will never have the means and the capability to develop the necessary implementation means, not to say standards, to get them through. And then we could become maybe even an obstacle to those developments, which is in no way what we're looking for. But maybe I'd like to come back on AI in particular, and certifiability of AI. That's something, as you know, in EASA, we're working a lot on it from a holistic approach, and not for a given domain, but really AI. We have developed the famous roadmap, and now we're working on the first deliverables. And here, I would say, today we start to have a vision. It could be another webinar because I will not speak for ages on that one, but we start having a vision how to really make use of those AI tools to make our life easier. But we have to go through a necessary exercise, which is extremely consuming, time-consuming, demanding, to clarify trustworthiness aspects, etc., explainability, and so forth. Then how to certify it. And once we're ready to certify it, I think we will be able to solve a lot of our issues and then to make efficiency gains. So it's always a matter of balance, how to invest together at the beginning, and how to make sure that what we invest is really money for value, and then in the end we can really certify or implement or industrialize or put into service whatever product. So it's always the same problematic, I would say. So that was in a nutshell what I had in mind for them. Thanks.
Thanks, Alain. Bruno, if I put the same question to you from an industry point of view, I know that, for instance, a lot of the ATM industry there would be a perception that we have highly bespoke system configurations and tailoring of systems. Yet if we're moving to a service-oriented architecture, if I look at, for instance, Thales would have made a major investment, for instance, in cybersecurity in other industries. And, you know, I think there's an obvious opportunity for cross-fertilization. So how does, from an industry point of view, how do you see that happening? And what's the implication in terms of the way which we actually approach standards, or the way the industry would like us to approach standards in that context?
Thank you, Philip. I think that's a very interesting question indeed, and there are different ways, different aspects to it. The first one is purely, I would say, industrial and technical and so on. And so that's seen from my point of view, there's no particular issue there, except that we need to understand how we, I would say, smoothly and seamlessly to some extent migrate from existing systems in operation to the new systems with a different, completely different infrastructure and architecture, which is really an issue. But in technical terms, there's no many problems there, because frankly speaking, and mainly in terms of the ground ATM systems, we have been actually using COTS and open, I don't know if open is the right term, but standards, for example, IT standards and quite generic IT standards for a long time now. So that's not something completely new for us. So this aspect of introducing this more systems from other domains and so on, is not necessarily a technical problem. The technical, and I would say the industrial problem we'll see, and it's operational too, is to migrate, I would say, all these systems we have in operation, all these systems we have that are operated by NSPs at the moment, for example, to migrate that without too much, I would say, disruption from the current situation to something that is a target and service-oriented target or whatever. That's the first point. The second point is that I turn back to Alain, and okay, the second point is linked to regulation, how regulation can adapt to this. And actually, because it's fair, we know that for a long time we had cuts in our systems, but we know that for a long time it's been very difficult in making sure that we were able to put these systems in operation due to the fact that there was some safety demonstration to bring on the table and things like that. And it's in some cases it seems much easier to do that with a brand new things that we redeveloped than with something existing which was not very efficient or relevant. So that's the tricky part of it, I guess, and that's something to work with the other, of course. And I see that Alain is very much aware about that. So that's important. And I would say the last thing is that, of course, we will. Everybody will be happy to use things that already exist, because when you say let's avoid reinventing the wheel, of course everybody is happy with that. And now I go back to what Robin said previously, that it's fair, except that we need to make really sure that the thing we reuse, it fits for purpose, and we need to really have defined the purpose. And if the purpose is not exactly the same, that's difficult to reuse sometimes. And so we need to really work on this and make sure that we do not reuse things that are not relevant. But otherwise, yes, I think that everybody is ready to go for that, because that's certainly very beneficial to the overall domain and industry. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruno. So, Robin, again, you touched on service-oriented architecture and particularly artificial intelligence. I think that it's fair to say it represents a certain challenge at the research and development level. How do you think, what do you think the impact of this will be in terms of in relation to kind of standardization, in the sense that it gets incorporated in terms of timing and number of standards actually in the research and development process?
That's a very complex question. I think it's what Alain was saying about the work being done at the moment in the EASA and in wider forums is actually of primary importance here. AI and machine learning are affecting many aspects of our lives, and we're still not yet fully to grips with how to deal with it. In some places it's less important. So if you've got your domestic automatic hoover that goes around and cleans the floor, then that's not quite as critical as going to single pilot operations, for example. So there's degrees of complexity here that we need to get to grips with, and we're actually quite a long way from fully understanding that. An example of the current problem is, shall we say, use space. To start with, we've got to the first stage of use space, a new regulation coming into force, but it's still very much a segregation-based, try it out, see what we can do stage. And that's good. There's some very good work gone into this. But the vision for use space is a highly automated environment with no equivalent, if you like, to manual air traffic control, and even vehicles that are, to use that horrible word, autonomous. What autonomous actually means is still subject for debate, and how to fit it into the aviation environment is something that I, for one, run away from bravely. I think it will become more and more important, both for the delivery of services and the execution of services, but also in the development of said standards. If you're going to have a heavily AI automated machine learning environment, then it could well be that the only way you're going to find a way of incorporating it is to use that same technology and idea to make it come into play. But of course that isn't something we're going to do tomorrow. So I think we need to be careful. We need to recognize it's there, understand the great benefits it has to offer, but still take it one step at a time. I think also one thing we need to bear in mind here for both this element and the previous subject that was mentioned on service delivery is something which isn't mentioned about maybe as much as it should be, and that's the human dimension. When you're trying to link two ATM systems together, it's quite often a question of getting the right ones and zeros in the right place. I simplify, obviously, but when you start bringing people into the mix, particularly at distributed sites with different cultures and big distances, and then you've got to introduce things like redundancy, commonality of training for the engineers as much as for the operators. These are elements which also come into play, particularly if you're thinking about automating any processes in that overall system. So it is very complicated at all levels, including not just the technology and the standards as we see them today, but also the impact on the human players in the overall system.
Thanks, Robin. I just want to move on to the topic of sustainability. It was mentioned a couple of times, and to me, that's one of the other big challenges, which, in addition to kind of, the future acceleration, sustainability now is deeply embedded at a political level in terms of priority right across a number of industries. So, I suppose, Alan, you touched on the whole issue of how that now needs to be embedded. You've mentioned, I mean, a very good example of the CO2 certification of aircraft, for instance. Do you see a parallel process having to develop within the ATM industry whereby this needs to be incorporated? How do you see that? How do you see that playing out?
That's a very interesting question, and I think we will have part of the reply today, in fact. For sure, I see a similar path. How to implement it is still not clear completely to my mind. You know, for instance, that we are working in the other on this eco-label. Eco-label, the frame is not yet 100% defined, but we speak about CO2 emission for a product, for an engine, for certification, in a very concrete, discrete, I would say, environment. And now, if we really want to move to a sustainable system, we have to consider it end-to-end, from design to operation, and of course, ATM here will play a key role. So the approach, when we speak about service-oriented standards and systems, clearly here, and that's where AI and machine learning will play a key role in helping us to implement it. But clearly here, sustainability will be part of this new design of systems. If not, we will miss one element in the complete chain, which at the end of the day will reduce a bit the benefit we could get out of it. It's something we have to tackle again end to end. We are more and more working into integrated systems. An aircraft alone, a system alone, an equipment alone, an ATM system, environment alone will never achieve the political vision. So again, here, what we do is to prepare the next step and the next one and the next one. And of course, for me, ATM in that respect will have a major role to play in terms of how we demonstrate that we are within the Green Deal constraints and how we really move toward a more decarbonized environment and how, in fact, we really have put in place an aviation system which is sustainable. And then the public will be quite comfortable, I hope. Thank you.
Good. Bruno, the same question to you on sustainability. I know that it presents particular challenges from the industry, and I know from talking to people at Thales that you do have a number of environmental and sustainability initiatives. Where do you see sustainability fitting in terms of how we would re-examine perhaps the way we would develop standards and what the implications might be?
Alors, that's a very interesting point, really, because we have started for a number of years now to really address this aspect of sustainability of our system. There are two ways actually to see there are two aspects in it. The first aspect is the actual I would say impact of the systems we deliver and we produce. If you consider, for example, the energy consumption of an ATC center or a navette equipment or whatever, and all that is really the topic of analysis and really design evolution at the moment in order to really assess and go for a given level of I would say of reduction of the impact. So that's really something that we have ongoing at the moment, and purely industrial analysis of that. And then, of course, there is the impact, I would say, of if I take the case of an ATM system, the impact of the ATM system and the operation it can support in the way, I would say, the overall aircraft evolution in the air will impact. And for example, reducing the length of the routes of the trajectories will be a significant impact. So you have two levels there. There is these computers I put somewhere, either in a data center, either in a room or whatever. What impact do they have? And it's not necessarily neglectable. And on the other side, the function that bring the system, what do they support as a reduction in terms of the environmental impact of I would say, the evolution of the aircraft. So there are two aspects in it. Now, what is not completely clear to me, and maybe I've not thought enough to this before the webinar, is how this has to be reflected in standards. Really, okay, that's something that goes for the systems or the solutions. How far does it need to be reflected in standards? I would say that I have no answer so far, but I'm quite open to think about that and work with all the people around the table to discuss that. Thank you.
So maybe I'll turn it over to Robin. I mean, you touched on this point, Robin, and from the research and development side, and given the kind of rapidly evolving nature, if I can put it that, both in terms of regulation and industry expectations about how sustainability can evolve, how can R&D engage with the various communities to start, if you like, preparing conditioning expectations so that further down the line, those sustainability requirements are embedded in perhaps in the standards or of some of the research solutions?
Yeah, thanks, Philip. I think if I may put it in very bold terms, we need to stop greenwashing. We need to realize that this is very important to all of us. And so when we start addressing environmental issues, sustainability issues, it has to be the same as looking at performance issues and availability issues and this kind of thing, like any other factor of a new concept, not added on the end, say, oh, and is it environmental, or how can we make it look like it fits a target? It has to be a genuine part of what's going on. And that's true for the research team. You say, how can we bring agencies together? Well, one of the beauties of an environment like the CESAR environment is that we have a large number of of participants, of players, stakeholders who are coming together to do the research and ultimately the demonstrations. Each of them bring to the party their own viewpoint, and they are all very interested in environmental sustainability issues as well. So they all have their point of view. People are starting to take it seriously. So it just has to now be business as usual, and that's the same in the standards. So if we get to the end of a research program, we need to look at a CBA, and including with the C bit is the cost of making it sustainable, and then the B bit is what's the benefit to the user, but also benefit to the environment, for example, so that we can use the same model, if you like, to do a balance check, and then the standards need to reflect that too. I would like Bruno, I'm afraid I don't have the answer for what that will look like, but somewhere inside that document needs to be something that covers the whole life impact of whatever the concept is on the environment, and how that is calculated and dealt with through the life, from research through to decommissioning. And for me, this has to become day-to-day business, not something added on at the end.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's something the aviation industry in particular has to be very clear at when it's dealing at a political level. I'm conscious I'm slightly up against the clock here, but I do want to come back to the issue of collaboration, which I think everyone has touched on. And I suppose what's interesting to me is that you now have a situation, for instance, where EASA's role has changed in terms of increasing the scope in terms of this area. I think you have a new deployment manager, have a new Cesar JU being established. So it's really a kind of a time of flux in terms of how it works. If I come to you, Alan, first, I mean, EASA's new agenda-setting role has been celebrated as an emerging opportunity. So how do you see your role evolving now concretely in terms of helping with this, as we spoke earlier about the ATM certification architecture? What, from a concrete point of view, do you think, how do we need to work more collaboratively together?
Alors, to keep it short, because I see also the time, I think we will be really involved in setting objectives. That's the first thing we have to agree upon. So we really have to define overall objectives, and we have to stick to this. It's an overarching issues everywhere. Objectives, be it performance, be it safety objectives, be it environmental objectives. But as a regulator, now it is our duty. It is part of our basic regulation to set the scene. And once we have done this, commonly, of course, with stakeholders, it's not fait du prince, as we say in French, of course. Once we have done this, then we see a major role for standardization bodies to help us in defining means of compliance or means of implementation. And of course, this would have to be done all together in a common forum. We have to ensure that whatever we define as an objective is feasible, achievable, the usual keywords, but it's not only buzz, that's what we have to do. And that we can fulfill the political expectations. And that's where we have the safety regulator in our new, let's say, expanded role, a mission which is really, really important. And of course, we are prepared to invest in it. And that's what we said before about the coordination groups, EU coordination groups. That's for us an ideal place to define those objectives together. They could play a potential role here, a leading role altogether, to make sure that whatever we define as a vision and objective is feasible, and that SDOs and industry in general may live with it and even support us in the development. Always think about a regulation and means of implementation. And that's where those EU coordination group, we have to get them up to speed, will or could play a key role to help the system to tackle all of those changes ahead of us. Thanks.
Okay. Bruno, from an industry point of view, I presume, particularly in a post-COVID environment, investment in this will be challenging, as it will for quite a number of things. How do you see, from an industry point of view, you'd like to see that collaboration move ahead and coalesce together?
If I strictly take the view of industry there, and that the point is that I think that we have in the ATM domain at least, and I think in aviation in general, we have at the working level, I would say, a very high level of collaboration already existing. If you just consider that for years now we have programs like CESAR that supports this collaboration at the R&D level. We have a standardization organization where we can work together, that give a forum for working together, all the stakeholders involved in building the standard themselves. So I think this is in place. We need to make sure that it continues and that it still works in the same and maybe in a more efficient way, but already at least in the same way. Of course, what is sometimes difficult is that at some time during the overall duration of the project and so on, there are some changes in the roles and responsibilities of various organizations, so we need to adapt at some stage, but still that makes sense. Then we see this point, and I think that Alain answered properly to this, the fact that, of course, we will have to get some coordination and I would say maybe roadmap definition and so on for supporting the overall standardization activities. And for this, I guess we have the forum for that with this European standardization groups that are in place and that can support this. So I think that we have the framework, frankly, and really what we need is to run it and have it working properly. Thank you.
Okay. So Robin, I suppose from the SJU point of view, how do you, in terms of this, how do you think we can achieve a more unified and joined up planning process between all the different organizations through the value chain? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I'd like to start by supporting what Bruno said about let's build on what we've got. What we need here is evolution, not revolution. We already have some pretty good bodies that actually do support each other, and we have a process. What's going on with the evolution of the EU SCG, for example, EASCG, is very much evolutionary, looking to make better use of the tools that we currently have. But we do have an opportunity here with the changes that you referred to earlier on, in that we now have the Digital European Sky Strategic Research Innovation Agenda, which is in turn forming the basis of the new CESAR 3 program to deliver the European ATM Master Plan and the airspace architecture study. Now, these give us a very clear vision of where we should be going, and including the sustainability piece and the need for all stakeholders to work together. By starting at the beginning at R&D with people working together and then supporting and understanding the role of the standardization agencies and the coordination groups that exist, we can bring those two together in a more effective and more efficient way. It requires genuine collaboration, genuine coordination, so as well as the all-important top-down as I mentioned in my introduction, the all-important top-down element is really, really important. Give us this vision, but there are other aspects too coming from industry and other players, from airspace users, from other agencies that are involved with this that also need to be heard. And as long as we can discuss, talk, and steer things correctively with a new, efficient EASCG, etc., I think we're on a good direction.
Very good. Thank you, Robin. So at this point in time, I think, first of all, I'd like to say that has been a really interesting discussion which we've had. It's been some really interesting topics. I have a lot more questions here which are coming in, which we would have liked to have time to ask, but unfortunately we've run out of road a little bit. So I think what we'll see here is we revisit some of these in a little bit more detail, perhaps in another technical webinar, because I think there's quite a lot of interest in some of the issues which were raised here. So again, I just want to thank the panel for all of the interesting discussions which they have. I think the key takeaways for me really is around being clear about the purpose of what we want the standards for, greater collaboration, and preparing to embrace the change which is there, which comes in the future, and perhaps being more open to also adopting other more open standards if we think they're appropriate, while at the same time maintaining the level of safety within the industry to make sure we don't compromise on that as well. So it's an interesting balance and tension between that. But I think the panelists today, who are excellent, really covered off some of those issues in a great way. So at this stage, I just wanted to say thanks to the panel, but just to remind you to stay tuned for our next webinars on the 17th of July. We have one dealing with real-time simulations, which have some really interesting examples of some improvements which have been made in various areas. And then on the 12th of July, intermodality and regional connectivity, which is dealing with how the next level of UAV change and regional change and connectivity and all of that thing kind of hangs together. So we look forward to seeing you again at some stage. I'm sure we'll be also revisiting some of the issues raised here today. If you have some questions and I didn't get an opportunity to cover those, I will try and get direct answers to people involved, or perhaps pass them on to specifically where you have raised them for some individuals. So again, on behalf of Eurocontrol, I'd like to thank you for your participation. I hope everybody stays safe and stays well, and we look forward to seeing you sometime shortly in the future. Thank you again.